fair to say that in this political election cycle, we as voters are having our time wasted more often than not by blustering bags of wind who seek to convince us why they should be our leaders while telling us relatively nothing about how they would govern and what they would actually do to be of service to the taxpayer. One thing they could all do, the very least, talk about the stunning amount of waste running through our government and maybe begin with how they would change America from being a slumlord and wasting billions of our dollars on buildings we never use and real estate that sits there occupied by more weeds than people putting it to good use. Let's dig in with a lady who wastes not 1 second of her time or ours as she details all this waste around us. Vice President for Policy and Communications at Citizens Against Government Waste, Leslie Paige. Leslie, always a pleasure to see you. But we always have to talk about waste and money here and politicians who don't do a damn thing to actually fix it. Now let's talk about buildings. Taxpayers are paying up to $8 billion, probably even more than that when it comes to all these wasted buildings. And I want to get into property management here in a minute, which has got to be one of the biggest ridiculous things to call the U.S. government here. But this is not a new story, though. But it deserves our attention. Why is it not getting fixed when I see people like Tom Coburn, who said years ago, oh, yeah, we know all about it, and we got to fix this?
Well, Happy New Year. And here we are.
Happy New Year. Let's talk waste.
Happy New Year. Let's talk about government waste. Nothing's changed. But here we are. Yeah, so we're going to talk about what we call in the biz, they call it federal real property. That's the term of art that the federal government uses for the buildings it owns and leases. And this is done predominantly and exclusively through the General Services Administration, which is essentially the government's landlord. And they own billions of square footage of federal property that they either own outright or that they lease. And federal agencies pay the GSA for the privilege of that, and so the GSA, that's how it's done. But essentially, it's the taxpayers paying those bills, of course. It's never the government agencies don't have any money on their own. They get it from taxpayers. The latest, and by the way, the Government Accountability Office has had the GSA on its high-risk list for many, many years in terms of its management or mismanagement of its federal real property. They can't even, by the way, determine how much they actually have because they have a database that is incomplete, inaccurate, and everybody measures their property differently. So you can have a building, you could have a small shed, you could have a tower out of Dulles. All that comes under the rubric of federal real property. It's counted, all of it's counted differently. So saying that they've got all this stuff is not even potentially a clear picture. The latest outrage, and this is the top of the line clickbait headline that you get, was the GSA just built a building for $73 million. It was a 180,000 square foot building that was theoretically supposed to be for a law enforcement entity. But they never consulted with the law enforcement entity, the Federal Protection Service, which is the entity that's supposed to protect workers in the buildings and visitors to the buildings. They never consulted with them. So when it was built, at the end, FPS, the Federal Protection Service, said, you know what, this doesn't have the kind of wall space we need, it doesn't have the kind of storage we need, it doesn't have any of the facilities,
doesn't have enough cable, doesn't have enough satellite to direct TV, doesn't have enough for our NFL games to be shown. Yeah, the same thing.
Well, no. Well, according to the GAO, they were saying, listen, we have nowhere to store our weaponry, we don't have any room for cells, you guys put the wrong walls in. So they said, we can't use it. And this is simply because there's no communication between the GSA and the FPS. And by the way, this is not the first time, speaking of long-standing problems, the GAO has written at least a dozen reports since I don't know when, in the 90s, about basically how the GSA doesn't communicate and has all kinds of problems managing its property, which is essentially our property.
Now, there's the thing I want to hit on. I got about a minute left here, but property management is the phrase that comes into real property management. Is it not fair to say that if the U.S. government or a legislator, a lawmaker, is going to solve this, the first thing you do is get the government out of the business of being a property manager? We have no clue how to do it.
No, we do not. And the fact of the matter is there's all kinds of obstacles. If you look back over the history of it, there are lots of obstacles if you've got a lot of abandoned, underutilized buildings, which, by the way, they do. They have a large percentage of underutilized and unoccupied buildings that they are required to maintain and keep. They're supposed to try and sell them. In fact, the Obama administration actually set a standard and said we want to get rid of a certain percentage of these buildings, square footage, over a period of years. Hasn't happened. Why? Tons of obstacles. First thing they have to do, for example, and this is just one of the obstacles, is determine if they can be used as homeless shelters. Now, which is a very laudable goal, and we do
Sure.
have people living on the street in this horrible weather we're having up here on the Atlantic seaboard and elsewhere. The bottom line is this slows the process down incredibly. And don't ask me what else, but they've got a whole layer of bureaucratic hoops that they have to jump through.
Oh, no,
in order to be able
unfortunately,
to
I can't
divest
ask you about it
themselves.
because we'd be here for a week and a half by the time we got through those
Yes.
layers. I want to remind everybody, ask the people who want to become your elected officials what they are doing about this. Educate yourself on it. Go to cagw.org, learn more about it. Seriously, ask the people who want to be your president, your senators, your mayors, whatever, but specifically the federal government, what they're doing to save your money. Leslie Paige, Happy New Year again. You're right, it's always a pleasure. We'll see you
Happy
again
New
next
Year.
week. Take care.
See you next time.
Stay with us. The fastest 60 minutes of news that wastes not a second of your time. The Hardline continues.